The Residential Tenancies Housing Emergency Measures in the Public Interest Amendment Bill 2016. I call on Deputy Richard Boyd Barrett to move the second reading.
Move.
Deputy Boyd Barrett has moved that the bill be read a second time. You have 15 minutes.
Okay. Thanks, Last Count Corla. Well, on the day that's in it, I first of all can't help but vent my frustration that Minister Coveney is not here to. Okay, well, I will be glad when he is, because I've had growing frustration over the last number of months that the issues of urgent and critical importance facing huge numbers of our citizens are going to get drowned out, and are already being drowned out, in the hubbub of the personality contest that is going on within Fine Gael. And certainly that frustration on my part has escalated in the last few days, where the media is awash now with, and I fear will be for weeks, with the beauty contest between the two candidates for the Fine Gael leadership, drowning out really serious, critical issues of importance to our citizens. And while, of course, who the next Taoiseach is not an unimportant issue, it certainly should not be allowed to drown out critical issues facing ordinary people. And no issue is more important, more urgent and more critical than the housing, homelessness, eviction and rental crisis now facing tens and tens of thousands of our citizens and inflicting really appalling hardship on them. And I would argue very strongly that the evidence is now piling in on a daily basis that the government's approach to dealing with this crisis is failing, and failing disastrously. And that in particular, the Rebuilding Ireland plan, the Residential Tenancies Act that was brought in by Minister Coveney in December has absolutely failed, and is going to fail further to address a crisis, an emergency that is absolutely spiralling out of control. And in the last couple of weeks, I have used the Leader's Question time that was available to me to try and highlight just how bad the situation is in a number of areas, and how existing policies and legislation have failed to deal with the real crisis that is being faced by families and individuals and children, tragically, right across this city and right across urban areas, the length and breadth of the country. And that failure comes in a number of forms, and I want to say that we do not believe this bill alone is the panacea to all of the problems that need to be addressed if we're going to deal with this emergency, but it is part of a suite of measures that need to be taken urgently on an emergency basis to stem this crisis. What are the wider suite of measures that have needed? Well, we've said it multiple times. I won't spend a great deal of time going through it. The ultimate solution to the current crisis is the provision of a massive amount of council housing, directly provided housing by the state itself, by local authorities, not the outsourcing of social housing to the private sector. That is the critical thing we need to do. We also need to immediately stop selling off via NAMA residential property, land banks and so on to vulture funds who are gaining oligopoly oligopolical control, whatever that word is, a virtual monopoly of control over residential property and land, and ratcheting up rents, evicting people, and escalating and worsening the housing crisis. But one critical aspect of what needs to be done is contained in this bill, and that is to deal with spiralling rents and the eviction crisis. And Minister Coveney's bill prior to December claimed to be an effort to address that, and I would put it to him that recent weeks have shown clearly that it failed to do so, because it is riddled with loopholes. And those loopholes were particularly demonstrated in the Robin Hill case. Mistake number one in wider policy terms is NAMA selling off huge portfolios of residential properties to these vulture funds to give them the opportunity to ratchet up rents and evict people. But then in terms of what they can do to tenants, the flaws in your legislation become clear. The rent pressure zones, which are not dissimilar to the fair rent zones that we propose in this bill, which are supposed to limit rent increases to 4% per year, have a number of key get-out clauses for vulture funds, as we've seen in Robin Hill, and tragically, I think we're going to see a lot more of this. If you think about the size of Project GEM, $3 billion worth of assets, we're going to see more of this. What are the loopholes? Loophole number one is if they claim they're doing substantial refurbishment to the apartments, they can go beyond the 4%. Loophole number two, they can introduce backdoor charges. In the case of Robin Hill, heating and hot water charges to effectively increase the rent dramatically, way beyond the 4%. Loophole number three, Minister Coveney's legislation allows for them to go beyond the 4% if they can make a case that the rent that they are charging, that they are restricted to under the rent pressure zones, is leading to a significant loss vis-à-vis what they'd make if they got full market value. These are all major get-out clauses, all of which are being exploited by the new owners, Cerebus, the vulture fund, in Robin Hill. And the other big loophole, of course, is the Tyrrellstown Amendment, and we warned you about this, that allowing up to 9 people to be evicted in multi-unit complexes means precisely that's what they go and do. They evict up to 9 people and then can do so in phases over a period of time. All of those things are happening in Robin Hill, showing the major flaws in your legislation. The other big issue which this bill seeks to address, which is another central element, flawed element, I would argue, Minister, of your housing policy, is in the area of HAPS. HAPS was described by you as a secure form of social housing. And what we discover in the last few weeks is that tenants who, in many cases, have been homeless, sometimes for a year or two, get a HAPS tenancy, think they have secure social housing, and then their landlord says, sorry, I'm evicting you. I'm selling up, I'm evicting you, and they're faced with homelessness again. Let me read from a young woman today, Amanda, who was at our press conference about the bill. I was homeless last year. I was told HAP was my only option to get myself out of homelessness. Now, a year later, I'm now facing homelessness again. I can't find a property to rent within the HAP limits for my family size. The stress of the situation has really taken its toll on my health. I am suffering with postnatal depression, and now I'm feeling a lot worse than I was before. I cannot even sleep anymore. It's just a constant worry, not only for me but for my 3 kids. I lost everything when I was homeless before, but I built my life back up and got things together for the kids. Now we are back to square one. It's devastating. All I want is a secure home. And just to add, by the way, to her situation, when she is told to go out and find another HAPS herself which cannot be found, she points out to the council she hasn't got the money for a deposit even if she found one, and the council say, you already have a deposit with your existing landlord, so we're not giving you another one. Right? So it's just totally impossible. And this is against a background where Simon Report this week, the homeless NGO reports that average rents in Dublin for a two-bedroom property are now €2,629, against a HAP limit that is €1,275. It's incredible, right? So the HAP support is less than half average rents in Dublin now for the same size property. So it can't work. It just can't work. And it isn't working, and people like Amanda are suffering the consequences. So against that background, our bill does something very simple, Minister. First of all, it recognises there's an emergency and establishes an emergency regime to deal with areas where the homelessness and rental crisis is out of control, and gives the power of the Minister to designate those areas fair rent areas. And we know you can do this, Minister, and the authors of this bill, who worked with myself and Breed and Gino, dealt extensively with the legal advisers here in the Parliament, and it has been crafted to essentially employ the same logic as the FEMPI legislation, which was used to cut pay and public service pensions. Okay? So we know the government can do this, introduce emergency legislation, get around constitutional barriers, so-called, on the basis of declaring an emergency. This can be done in an area where there's an actual emergency, in the area of housing. So that's the first thing it does. It gives you the power to declare an emergency in particular areas and to take emergency measures that follow from that. And what are those emergency measures? The emergency measures are that in those areas you can pin rents back to 2011 levels, because since 2011 rents have gone up by 60%. 60% to the unaffordable levels I've just described. If you do what this bill proposes and bring rents back to a base year of 2011 and allow for the consumer price index, average rents in Dublin would fall to around your HAP limits. In other words, HAP might be viable. I don't agree with it as a solution, but it might at some level be viable if you did this. Otherwise, it's a complete fantasy that will lead to an ever-worsening crisis. So it pins rents back to that level. It allows for consultation and submissions to be made to the PRTB, who will set fair rents. But the baseline is 2011 rents before the 60% increases that followed in the subsequent years. So it becomes possible. It also takes into account, if you like, CPI and wage increase levels. And just so people know, rents have gone up since 2011 60%. The CPI in that period is 1.6, and wages have gone up by 2.6. Right, so rents have outstripped by a multiple of about 10 increases in the CPI and in wages. Completely unsustainable. So this legislation seeks to address this on the same basis that FEMPI cut back on wages and pensions for public sector workers. Unjustly, in that case, I would say. The other key thing it does in these fair rent areas is address the security of tenure issue, which would prevent what's happening in Robin Hill, would prevent what's happening to people like Amanda, who's being evicted by a HAP landlord, because in those areas it would remove sale as a grounds for eviction, and it would remove almost all the existing grounds for eviction except emergency circumstances for the family of the owner of the property themselves, where they could make a case to the PRTB they actually need the place for themselves. But it would rule out vulture funds evicting people under spurious justifications, essentially to get vacant possession and ratchet up rents and drive people into homelessness. Now, it seems to me that is a fair and reasonable thing to do. I mean, personally, we would do it on an ongoing basis, but what we're saying is, at least, let's establish the powers to do it in areas where there is now an emergency. Whatever you may say about the wider philosophical issue of rent controls, in the here and now, do it to prevent the profiteering on rents that is leading directly to evictions and homelessness and a social catastrophe which is inflicting incredible hardship on people. This can be done, Minister. This legislation is robust. We are not saying it is the complete solution by any means. We need to have the major social housing programme. We need to have a right to housing established in the Irish Constitution, rebalance property rights against the common good, but these measures could actually prevent the economic evictions that are going on and the rent racketeering that is driving people into homelessness. And I would appeal to the Government and the Minister to support this legislation and indeed the rest of the House.
Thank you.